All right, we will go ahead and get our session started for today. My name is Steve Ward. Thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time out of your calendars for this conversation. Hopefully, there'll be a lot that comes from it in terms of some educational material and some better understanding about what's going on with digital skimming and its threat landscape and the types of threats that are out there and how these work and how they can be stopped, how these attacks can be stopped. Quick little housekeeping. This is the first in a series of webinars that we are doing for the month of July. Progressively different subject matter and covering different topics. If you'd like, you can register for more in the series. I'm sure my colleague Scott can probably drop links in as we go along, so you have access to that. We're recording today's session. You'll get the on-demand version of the webinar in the next day or so. Someone from my team will reach out to deliver that, and then also to ask if you'd like to engage in any further dialogue. Feel free to engage there, or I will leave my email in today's chat and give you the opportunity to engage with me directly if you'd like. However, you would like to drive next steps or follow up or get more insights, we're going to make it easy for you. Also, throughout the session, we will have the phones on mute, but don't think that precludes you from asking questions. Please ask questions as we go along. I'm happy to make sure we can get them answered. Tail end of the session, we'll try and get you out of here in about 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, if I can talk fast enough. Yeah, there's other things that are on the horizon that you'll want to know about, and I'll get into some detail on that as we go along. So today here we're talking about digital skimming prevention, the inner workings of how these types of attacks work, and really delivering insights from Source Defense, who is Mastercard's global partner in digital skimming prevention, and we're very proud to be working with Mastercard in this effort. What it means, for us to be, working with Mastercard is sort of twofold. We are providing them insights and intelligence related to the threat landscape. We're working with them to help identify accounts, or merchants that are under attack. We're feeding that data into their intelligence streams and into their account data compromise team, and working with them on PCI forensic investigations and account alternative account investigations. And more importantly, than just sort of keeping a pulse on the problem, we are bringing a preventative solution to the world that is designed to help companies of all sizes, whether you're an enterprise, one of the big global retailers, right, or merchants, or whether you are a small merchant, or a merchant acquirer or a payment service provider looking to help inoculate an entire group of tens of thousands of merchants. We've got solutions for all of that. And the reason that we really, I think have become sort of the name synonymous with digital skimming prevention, and that the Mastercard relationship even exists, is because this is something that we've been focused on for the entirety of the life of our company. We, saw a problem back in 2016, really the dawn of mage card attacks, or now referred to as digital skimming or e-skimming attacks. We knew that the threat landscape was moving towards the browser, and specifically towards client-side attacks, and that adversaries, needed to find new ways, especially with the evolution of EMV and your chip and pin, as you might refer to it as, to steal this data. And they saw an opportunity in attacking data at the point of input, absolutely just stealing it directly from the forms that, enable online interaction and online commerce. And so while, a lot has been done to protect data in transit and data at rest, data at the point of capture, really is the new playing field. And so we came to the market and said, there's a hole here in web security. Yeah, web security traditionally, only addresses up to the server side, when the application itself is actually running in, millions of consumer browsers, and that's where your sort of weakest link is. And we have brought to the table what we think is sort of the last mile, requirement in web security. And we think that it's definitely something that you need to be looking at, not just if you need to adhere to PCI compliance, but most importantly, something that you need to be looking at as an overall security solution for your organization, from a two-pronged kind of perspective. One, securing against attacks that happen on the client side or in the browser, and two, preventing inadvertent data leakage with the partners that power your website. And that's happening more and more as, sort of this integrated web of supply chain partners is increasingly, harvesting data for all forms of different, business value. And sometimes, unfortunately, it oversteps and data is taken that and shared, that shouldn't be because it's data, it's privacy protected, or it violates, any other, sort of regulatory requirements that are out there. So we've been pioneering in this space. We've been at the tip of the spear in the space. We've got the solution, I think, that has the broadest footprint. We are addressing data security, data privacy, and obviously compliance. Compliance is PCI, but it's also GDPR and HIPAA and FFIEC and any number of different, compliance regimes that you may find yourself, having to deal with. And so PCI mandates a requirement, but these others, definitely have elements to them where, this approach to containing and protecting data, as it's captured, is absolutely critical. So if you find yourself, if you're an organization that's sort of like multidimensional, or you're a merchant based on PCI definitions, but you're actually a pharmaceutical company or a pharmacy or a healthcare, just know that it has bleed over impact and sort of like secondary value, to attack this problem, not just from a PCI perspective, but more, broadly, as it relates to the other, compliance regimes you have to adhere to. We are a PCI compliance solution, which means that we have gone through our own attestation on compliance. We use IBM as our QSA. And we are a PCI PPO, a principal participating organization, which means that we are driving the standard forward. I myself sit on the PCI Board of Advisors for the next year and a half. So we've been on the PCI Board of Advisors since 2025. And when you look at sort of the work that we do, we really are plugged in at the ecosystem level for global commerce. So, Mastercard, has worked with us and said we're the partner they want to drive, solutions in market. We work with major merchant acquirers like Fiserv. We've got PSPs and e-commerce platforms that we support. We have 1,000 plus of the world's largest brands and countless in the medium sized world that use our solution for prevention and for compliance reporting. We work with the largest QSAs in the world, and so Coalfire and Viking Cloud and names like that, are organizations that we have done work with, partner with, and that we work in an integrated fashion with in market. We really are, sort of the backbone protecting this stuff, and so that gives us, a really, really unique view in terms of what's actually happening in the world, and that's really the gist of, what the rest of this discussion is about, right? I want to inform you about digital skimming so that you can understand how it works, you can understand what's prescribed in the DSS, whether or not it's effective, and what you really need to do, to take the right steps to eliminate and eradicate the threat for your organization. So the rest of this brief, here's the deal. You've got, services that run on your website, roughly 82% of the code that runs on your website that are completely outside of your control. You didn't write the code. You don't have visibility into it. You have no native management tools over top of it. That is the code that is, susceptible to attack in a digital supply chain attack kind of manner. That is the code, which is JavaScript, that can be compromised by adversaries, taken over, and used to do any number of things to change your payment flows, or to compromise, data security and take, steal, exfiltrate data, to an adversary. This is everything, from your video side of things to your analytics solutions to social media plugins. It's just all the stuff that you didn't, want to write and that your teams on the web dev side of things had no business trying to get into, but are really critical services for the performance of your website. And it's everywhere, and you're not alone, and you're not, immune either. Like the entirety of the world, 98%, 99% of all websites are running multi-party scripts on their site, and the vast majority still do not have controls in place over top of it. And as a result, the bad guys are sort of with impunity able to, conduct these digital skimming attacks. When they get control of this code, when they inject, the malware and sort of like their malicious scripting in there, they can do lots and lots of different things. They can change page content, which means they can, redirect users to directions that are outside of your intended payment flow, interrupt the payment flow, put them into websites that are under their control. They can add content, to your legitimate, flows, meaning text, video, form fields where they can capture data that you didn't intend to. They can obviously record keystrokes. That's a core part of the type of attack that we're looking at here, and then capture and exfiltrate data. They can also do a lot of really interesting things as it relates to persistence. And once they have that foothold, do things to sort of enable anti-forensic type techniques, and try and keep themselves embedded or establish a foothold for reinfection on your site. And I will talk about some of that in terms of some of the trends that we're seeing as we get a little deeper. So, you got all this code running, you don't manage it, you don't own it, you don't control it, you don't have visibility over it, and the bad guys are compromising it to steal data. This is a known problem. It's been a problem for, as I said, we saw it back in 2016. These types of attacks have been going on for the last decade. In the early stages, you saw a lot of headlines around it. British Airways, Ticketmaster, big brands hit by these types of attacks. Then it kind of cooled off, at least in the news cycles for a while. And you saw way more emphasis on ransomware and that scourge that represents. And so the conversation kind of died down, at least in the public domain and maybe inside your organization around the need to do something about it. But it didn't negate the threat, and it definitely did not dissuade the adversary from continuing to advance their capabilities and conduct these attacks. And our data shows that, proves that, and proves out that all this stuff is still happening. It's actually getting worse. It's proliferating. The capabilities are getting stronger. We're still as much in a problem space with this threat as we were almost a decade ago. But because of the fact that we don't have our sites attuned and there are not security solutions in place, and we have not put, sort of ubiquitous visibility, in place, we really don't know about it because the bad guys want these things to be slow and low. They want to fly under the radar. They want to hit you for a long period of time. And most breaches that we see, that we end up investigating or contributing to the investigation on, these are like 6 months to a year that sites have been compromised. And so it could be happening right now underneath your nose. I'll talk through, some of the techniques that they use to keep it that way, under the radar. But the industry has taken note. Mastercard's taken note. They've engaged with us to try and drive, this problem, into the gates of hell. And PCI DSS has taken note as well. Mastercard's not the only card brand, that has flagged this as a problem. Visa flagged that as a problem as many as 4 years ago, I guess now. And they've been continually reporting on it, and they've been telling you got to take action to stop it. And eventually, the DSS, version 4.0, now 4.0.1, caught up with that. And it is now mandated under PCI DSS compliance that you do something about this problem. And so, if you have not, and you don't have a solution in place, and I will talk about a viable solution versus, a solution in name only here in a minute, then you've got compliance issues and you're out of compliance. You risk fines, you risk, potentially kicked off the network. And, obviously, more important than that, you remain completely, in a sort of an exposed position to the threat. So you got to do something about this. The problem is real. The question is, what do you need to do? And I think the best way to answer that is to really unpack and understand how this stuff happens, how it works, and where some of the guidance that's provided right now and some of the thinking at the at least standards sort of body level is off base. Okay. And so what I'm going to talk through through the use of data and research and exposing you to these threats is the perfect state, not the mandated compliance state. Compliance requires you right now to address this problem as it relates to your payment pages. That's where the scope is outlined and justified under DSS. That is, a too narrow of a scope based on how these attacks work, and I'll talk to you about that. But it's what it reads right now. And you have to make sure that you are inventorying these scripts that are on the payment pages, and you're providing justification, and you're documenting that justification, and you've got authorization, and that's got to happen in an ongoing manner as new scripts are added, as scripts are removed. You got to have like documented workflow and documented evidentiary trail. You've got to, more importantly, have solutions in place to assure the integrity of the script, that its current performance, baseline performance has not been modified, that if it is modified, you have the ability to alert at minimum and respond in a rapid fashion, or in more ideal state, to prevent any malicious scripts from running on your payment pages. And then you've got to conduct monitoring now on a weekly basis, probably the most onerous monitoring requirement underneath the DSS, at least in terms of frequency. That's all what's required. That's all what's there. And if you check those boxes per se, you found yourself compliant. But if you check just those boxes and you narrow that scope and you only do those types of things specific to the payment page, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to make the very, very strong case that you are not secure from the threat. And so our position with the DSS and with the SSC, the Security Council, and through Mastercard and through all our relationships is that the DSS has to change. And that the scope must be increased. It needs to be looking differently, and that some of the advice given for reference controls need to be abandoned. Okay, and so that's all important stuff. That gets into what we've seen in market, what we continue to see in market in terms of the types of attacks and the things that are going on. From 2025, looked at that whole year, right? It's about we're halfway through 2026 now. I can't even believe it. I'll talk to you about a year's worth of threat research. I'll talk to you about the first quarter of this year's worth of research, and then I'll tease just one or two examples of Q2. But again, the Q2 report will be out like in a week. It all, sort of says a few key things, and it sort of builds on itself. 2025 told us, unequivocally that these attacks are proliferating in terms of the number, that they are gaining in sophistication in terms of the techniques that are utilized, that they are evolving to evade controls, that the bad guy effectively is looking at what our response is, and they're finding new and innovative ways to work around sort of the limitations to our response. I would say the evidence shows clearly that compliance alone would be creating a false sense of security. We are seeing an increase in not just card data theft, but in other forms of data being compromised and targeted. And that slow and low and that persistence that I talked about is a key theme both for the entirety of 2025 and for Q1 of 2026. Also in 2026 Q1, we saw a resurgence of attacks, not just targeting first-party scripts or third-party scripts, I mean, your digital supply chain, but actually trying to break into your server and compromise the script that you have written, the ones that you own, the first-party side of things. We're seeing silent skimming as an incredibly prevalent technique. It used to be different. It used to be that sort of this like double entry attack was more prevalent, which would require basically a failed checkout, and then the adversary would steal the data then, and then the consumer would have to re-enter data, triggering a lot of investigation into what might be going on the site. That doesn't happen that much anymore. It's more the silent skimming is used as a technique. We're seeing a tremendous focus on localization, geographic targeting, and pixel perfect spoofing, both of your page as well as the payment provider that you may be working with. And also, we're seeing the reach in to, in a lot of cases, people believe like a hardened iframe on a payment page is going to stop the threat. We're seeing iframe compromise, as well as, just complete spoofing and redirect outside of your payment flow. That's where a lot of that pixel perfect stuff comes into play. We're seeing attacks at scale, thousands of sites attacked, throughout Q1, thousands of sites in 2025. We're seeing major enterprises and mom and pops falling victim. A lot of banking got hit in Q1. I'll go through some of the verticals here in a second. But interestingly, on the T's for Q2, we saw major U.S. auto manufacturers, fall victim for a, pretty extensive period of time. Just out of the headlines from a week and a half ago, I believe it was, we're seeing poly market, crypto theft as part of this effort. And so, we're seeing sort of like, an expansion of both, I would say, sort of like targeted attacks as well as spray and pray, or like casting a wide net and trolling to see how many people can get hit. And we're seeing a major theme of CSP bypass. That poly market example that I just gave probably had one of the more sophisticated, content security policies in place, and it did nothing to prevent the attack. We're also seeing the use of CSP to weaponize and create, colonization inside the target environment, so that persistence, can be retained. Tens of thousands of sites were under attack in 2025. Fashion and apparel, travel and leisure, transportation, media, government services. Many whales, also just as many, mid-size, or level three in the PCI vernacular, or small business types of sites getting hit. Interestingly, we had done some research around the use of third-party supply chain based on the type of sub-industry you might be from a merchant perspective. And some of this actually tracks to sort of like the breadth of third parties being utilized. So what we found in our research was that, the more highly customizable the interaction or the product or the service that you sell, tends to lead to more third parties being plugged into the site. And something like fashion and apparel was one of the most, widely utilized, industries of third parties. And it's not surprising to see them on this target list, nor travel and leisure. The only one that, we really didn't see too heavily, in at least in 2025, that sort of maps to that like real big use of third parties, would be, like the high tech side of things. And that may just be because there's not as many transactions happening in high tech online. Some of that is carried over. We saw almost 100 different campaigns. And when we talk about a campaign, what we are saying is individual, at least indications of individual threat actors. Okay. There may be, some that are duplicating there, and that are, sort of more prolific. But this tends to look at the campaign, against independent threat actor ownership. And so what that means is, there's at least 100 active bad guys, out there running wide scale campaigns. God only knows how many thousands more, are out there, sort of like maybe in the onesie twosie kind of, theft rings. But that's only from our perspective. And so if we could see, nearly 100, independent campaigns, of wide scale, you might take that on an order of magnitude of 10, to assume what's actually happening out there, in the wild. And so that means this is happening all the time, every day, new things being launched. And, again, I think we're not hearing about it because it's just not as discoverable as some of these other things where, we have broader detection and forensic capabilities in place. We're seeing, the use more and more and more of complete legitimate services, either hijacked or spoofed. And Google Tag Manager is, a number one trend that we are seeing. It being abused in legitimate fashion and also spoofed because, most detection is not going to look for something that looks like Google. And I will talk through, some of the techniques that are being utilized in that regard. But kind of think of it as, high trust services are becoming more attractive to the adversary because they know that a lot of the approach to the problem is kind of, shall I say, pedestrian in the fact that it still relies on known good, known bad, for detection capabilities. We had seen at the tail end of 2025 what looked to be the development and release of like software as a service for these types of attacks, meaning bad guys can, basically rent, campaigns. That trend continued in 2020 in Q2. I'm sorry, Q1. Less so in Q2, but there is still a tremendous amount in Q2 that shows this trend line about all of those things that I just talked about. Um, in the first quarter, or I'm sorry, still in 2025, about 1,000 in a single campaign is basically what we're seeing. There could be more, but so there's simultaneous attacks that are happening, and the attacks are targeted across the entire site, not on the payment pages. Very, very important to note. Like when we see these types of attacks, they're running, at the parent level domain. And so, the attack is happening there and it's following the customer journey and it's interrupting the customer journey. It is not reliant upon or waiting to only attack and scrape off of the payment page itself. Very, very, very important that that be emphasized. Sites wide, not payment page, is where the adversaries are playing. We've seen worldwide attacks and with language models and modules that create localization. We have seen more than 10 platforms being targeted by attackers, so it's not just Magento or Adobe Commerce anymore. And again, this like use of legitimate services for the attack side of things. In 2026, the first quarter, we saw a couple thousand campaigns, so a little bit of a doubling, in terms of the number of sites attacked simultaneously. US Bank, Global Supermarket, thousands of small merchants. We've seen an 18% reinfection rate based on known victims. This indicates APT style, trends, anti-remediation, and ways for the adversary to find foothold. So sometimes when we detect an attack, we're not involved in the forensic investigation side of it. We're just flagging, this is occurring, right? And we're seeing that from the outside, kind of looking in, using our detection capabilities. We'll then go back, we'll look, it's gone, but then we see it, reestablished. And that indicates that the bad guy likes to go after the same target because they haven't been ferreted out, and they haven't been effectively detected, and they can use, that same victim multiple times to continue to enrich themselves. Yeah, so in Q1, we saw 25 unique campaigns, so that's on trend. Probably going to exceed, at the end of 2026, what our visibility was. We're probably going to be looking at 150, 200, type of campaigns that we've seen out there. Interestingly, we're seeing the use of CSP as a tool on the part of many organizations to try and prevent these types of attacks. It does not work as a preventative solution, and I will talk to you about that here momentarily, but I'll say it like now and probably 10 more times, and again, probably 10 more times. CSP is not a security solution against digital skimming attacks. It does not work. You should not use it. You should not use it as a strategy. You should not invest your time in that direction, and you should not use solutions that claim to be preventative but only put a GUI on top of a CSP. And I will hammer that home until I have no more breath in me. Also, what I will tell you is we're seeing the use of CSP to control hijacked websites and continually reestablish foothold on compromised websites by compromising the content security policy to allow whitelisting of continued new command and control infrastructure for the adversary. So not only is it not going to stop the problem, but the bad guys are starting to use it to keep you from ferreting them out during the forensic and incident response process. Okay, so that is not a good thing. Um, Getting into some of those harder truths and the conversation around what needs to change and the advice I would give to you and sort of like the masterclass in terms of like, how do you go back to your organization and really drive the right solution to this problem? I'm going to start ripping into what's wrong with the DSS. Okay. The threat is misunderstood. It thinks that, the people who wrote, the book on this thing, what now? I mean, I guess it's like 4 years ago. had the best understanding of how the attacks work. It ignored guidance from folks like us and others in the industry, definitely on the PFI front, jumping up and down saying things need to be changed. It was an old world understanding and a static understanding of the threat and of adversarial tradecraft. And so as a result, it misguides. It emphasizes the wrong controls. It puts, I think the wrong suggestion into the mind of people how they solve the problem. It looks at the scope and it narrows it down to only payment page because it's like, well, that's where the card data is entered, so that must be where the attack happens. And so it isolates focus in the wrong area and it does not keep people informed about what the true attack surface is. And, in a large sense, it kind of de-scopes and creates this really unbelievable loophole now for some of the more richest of the target community and provides a little bit of a compliance loophole that gets used as a shell game. And that's just not where we need to be as an industry. We don't need to be looking for ways to get around solving the problem. We need to be looking for ways to solve it. And they're not expensive. They're not difficult to deploy and maintain and manage. And this isn't some massive undertaking, and this isn't something you got to build, permanent staff behind and all of that. I can promise you that. All of our customers, share the same experience, which is this is set it and forget it type of solutions, like the best thing you can do in security because you don't have to build more process around it. But, still for whatever reason, human nature being what it is, we try and find ways to avoid, the investment or to deprioritize it based on the fact that we're off the hook, from a compliance scope or whatever. And it's just the wrong thing to be getting into if your mission truly is to protect your organization, drive down risk, protect the consumer, and ensure, sort of fiduciary responsibility, in this process. So on the control side, and again, I'm not going to just make these statements. I'm going to use the threat research and some of how these attacks happen. Sort of demonstrate the problem with you. PCI 4.01. If you read it right now, you'll see CSP and SRI content security policy and sub-resource integrity listed multiple times as potential controls. For or reference controls, for solving the problem. And Scott has already put out, because he's already heard me talk about it, the link for this white paper, behavior-based versus CSP and SRI, which is more effective. I will tell you, you could just basically read the cliff notes. Behavior-based is more effective because CSP and SRI aren't controls. They're unable to track against this evolving threat. They're static in nature. They use whitelisting and signature-based identification as an attempt to stop the problem. And all of the problem lies within the trusted network of parties, either your code or outside parties being compromised. And so when you talk about managing a content security policy effectively, what you're saying is, I'm going to create a list of all the services that are allowed to run, all the partners, all the contact, all the communication channels, that are allowed to be established. And I'm basically going to whitelist them. And this is like, antivirus in 2006. Okay. You wouldn't be looking at signature based, or whitelist based detection as a good strategy in 2026, right? If I compromise Google Tag Manager, if I compromise your video partner, if I compromise, which happened in one case of like a very large attack against like Sotheby's real estate, if I compromise, any one of your third parties, right? You've already allowed, the Trojan horse to be entered through the gates of the. So, you got to have a whitelist. It's your whitelisted partners that were going to be attacked. It's your whitelist partners that are opening the door. So how in the world could that be an effective approach, to the problem? It isn't. On the SRI front, it relies on establishing, effectively a fingerprint, right, for every script that's going to run on your site. But that fails completely against the way that scripts operate today. Scripts are dynamic. They change by time of day, by interaction from a user, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They offer no detection capabilities, neither of these approaches, and it's completely misleading. And so I'll hammer that home. 30 plus compromised campaigns where Google Tag Manager was compromised. Attackers are always hiding inside these allowed paths. Attackers are leveraging that trust. It happened very much in the case of that Polymarket attack that just happened a week or two ago, where it was a trusted third party, which, by the way, that third party we found deployed on like 2 or 3 thousand other websites. So one to many type of attack. Now, in the case of that Polymarket attack, Scott, I think we have a write up on that that you can share in the link as well. But in that instance, the attack was very much targeted at crypto and specifically at looking at crypto wallets, engaged with Polymarket. And very much looking at only the whales there. But the adversary had been deployed and effectively compromised, 2,500 sites, by compromising. I believe it was an email marketing vendor that had a pixel on for a tracking pixel on the websites. So that's a great example of the compromise just from a week ago, right? Of sort of that white hat or that trusted party. Why do attackers like want to go after this? They want to leverage trust. They want to leverage legitimate services that are less scrutinized. They know you don't have visibility in terms of actual script level activity and performance, so they can hide inside those tunnels, right, and not be detected. Um, they want to use your infrastructure for all forms of things, from everything from how to hide and their communications, how to deliver payloads, how to exfiltrate data. And so we're seeing things like the use of CDN and edge platforms like Cloudflare and Fastly and CloudFront to host malicious scripts with high availability, and because of that trusted domain reputation, to help propagate and spread infection. We're seeing things like serverless runtimes, cloud runtimes, like Google Cloud Functions, Azure Functions, used as exfiltration endpoints. We're seeing things like GitHub, right, and Pastebin to host obfuscated payloads. And even to poison legitimate repositories that you may build first party code on top of, and then things like messaging services like Slack, right? To be used as exfiltration channels with encrypted connections. So the whole nature of sort of cyber threat, writ large, and then specifically, in this case, is to use, trust to their advantage. And to hide inside, connections that are already established. With Google Tag Manager, what they're doing is they're using, centralized point of control for injection. They're using the ability, that it delivers to like propagate changes without, the need to push new payloads. They're looking at bypassing security filters. They're looking at container loading, unpacking, malicious payloads, not at the first container level, but maybe at the third container level. And so they're using some complex approaches. And so, a great example, CSP, SRI, these attacks don't rely on those things as a solution, right? The scope of the threat. I've kind of beat this up, right? But what I do want to get to is the notion that like, not only should you not just limit your view to the payment page, and you need to be thinking about this as a site-wide security solution and a site-wide problem. But you also should not rely on the notion that like, well, I have completely outsourced payment processing. So when they click checkout, it goes somewhere else, or I have an embedded iframe, and so that's safe. Evidence, all points to both of those things, being fallacies as well. And what do I mean by that is like we have seen. Hang on, let's see. Got to get this to advance, guys. Give me 1 second. Nope, come on. Oh, hang on, I got to be over here. We have seen, and the PFI community has seen, that nearly 100% of all the attacks that are happening out there for digital skimming, e-skimming, whatever, um, don't originate on the payment page. They actually originate site wide. We see, the push of site wide attacks. Using silent skimming, using the interception of form submissions, using the hiding in your flow and hijacking your flow. as a real, sort of, new way of this approach happens. And so, a great example is this thing we call the pizza method. It's inject a new payment option. The script adds a fake payment method to your checkout UI. It looks like a legitimate payment flow. They take over the checkout button, or they take over the next button. They force the gateway to redirect to their own compromised or illegitimate gateway. They completely mimic what would look like your checkout or what would look like that iframe environment. They capture the details and then they return the consumer back to you with a payment failed error, so that it just looks like a process that broke down. These fake experiences are indistinguishable from the real ones. You wouldn't know you were in it if you had told me that you go to your checkout every day. You would have no visual way to determine whether or not you're on your site or the bad guy has taken over and has redirected. We are seeing in this iframe bypass malicious scripts running in like, let's say, the context of like the WordPress end of things, like running in that trusted context. And as a result, being able to reach inside private sandbox iframes to read card data. And so, this notion of like, hey, well, I've outsourced it, I've offloaded it, or my PSP told me that if I use their iframe and I deploy it this way, yeah, sure, the iframe, may not be the direct source of compromise, but if I compromise the website, I can get access to it. And if I can just compromise the website anyway, your iframe is irrelevant because I can bypass around it. And so these are the types of things that like people, we got to get like educated into the community so that we understand exactly what's happening. We aren't thinking that we're solving problems. You're wasting time is what it is, and wasting effort, and both are money and both are valuable, right? On the compliance shell game, I told you to try to get out of here at 2:45, right? So here's all I would say. There were some changes made like right up at the last minute of compliance mandate, about January, March of last year. And what it did is it let a lot of people off the hook. You might be in that category where it paused your programs, it gave you the ability to look at it, might have given you like a pass depending upon the first modification that SAC-A that happened. But then there were subsequent changes to the SQA through FAQs. That's kind of like this weird convoluted way the council provides updates. That kind of put things back into scope, and it might have confused things, and your QSAs might have said you're okay, or your PSP might have said we got you covered, or whatever, right? It's all just a big game to try and get out of, doing the right thing. That is hard. It also, you might find, in addition to sort of like, sort of giving people wiggle room, there's a very, very big gap in compliance perception. We've had customers that have gone in thinking that they were fully compliant. They sat down with their QSA. The QSA said, "What are you talking about?" And then we immediately get like a call. Hey man, can you get me a solution in place? Overnight. We just failed our audit because we thought we were doing the right thing. We had CSP, we had SRI, we had sort of like ad hoc processes. But our QSA says we need something that really solves the problem, and we need something that gives them visibility into all things required under the DSS. Can you help? And the answer is yes, we can. And the answer is yes, we can deploy in 24 hours. And the answer is yes, we check all the right boxes. But the real important thing is we deliver the security that you need, and we do it in a way that doesn't require any of the heavy lift. And there is heavy lifting that is going to go along with either documentation you need for an audit, or that your merchants need for an audit if you're a QSA, or that your merchants need for an audit if you're a merchant acquirer on this call, or a PSP. There is stuff that has changed, and there's certain things that are non-negotiable. You have to have inventory, you have to have integrity, visibility, and you have to be able to detect and respond, or to outright prevent any of these types of attacks. But you're going to be asked for things that you didn't have in place, and you need to get it in place before your next audit, or else you're going to get failed, and you're going to be back knocking on our door. And that is like, you've got to have like an actual like trail of documented evidence that you have, an inventory of every script that you have, a business justification on it, that you have that as a process that like things are coming, things are changing, we're adding new things, we're taking things off. Here's why, here's the dates, here's the individuals. You need like a tracking capability for all of those changes that are happening on the site. You have to be able to demonstrate that scripts are behaving in their normal capacity. And if you're a QSA on this call, we actually have a solution that'll help you do that for free to help audit the environment. So just, ping me and we'll get you, hooked up with that. But like, a QSA is going to come in and they're going to say, like, show me that you have a way to prove that the behavior that the partner indicated is in place, and that no other behavior is taking place inside these scripts, and that you need to be able to detect changes to script content in real time, not just at deployment. And so that means you need to be able to document, look at, evaluate. Yes, this is legitimate. No, it's not. And then react and respond to that. And you have to have the ability to prevent and have an enforcement mechanism in place. So there's a lot that needs to be done. Yeah, QSAs are going to be asking more questions. And you need to be thinking about like the problem, with the right approach. We're here to help you do that. A couple other little tidbits I would leave for you, that kind of didn't fit into the sort of case I was trying to make is, we're seeing again more localization. We're seeing things like conditional triggers. Know that a lot of what these attacks will do is they'll only happen every 10th. They'll only happen every 100th, transaction, or they'll change and use not every user seeing the attack, selectively avoiding detection, responding and initiating an attack only on certain user paths, only on certain language. I'm going to attack your Latin American, business first, and then I'm going to go after Europe next, kind of thing. And multiple exploitation pathways being used is something we're seeing more and more of. We're also seeing, I mentioned this at the onset, more credential and PII harvesting, and more anti-forensic techniques. So
Okay.
we've got about
So
10. Thank you very much for the time. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you at the movies.